Yes, so I lost my son August 15th, 2023, without ever knowing he was depressed. My son was the most amazing young man. This is him. Graduate of United States Naval Academy 2019. He immediately started to just excel in submarine nuclear engineering school. He graduated at the top of his class. He was ordered to go to Norfolk because that's where the top percent absolutely has to go. And he quickly got promoted. So he was everything that I thought. He was a happy young man. He was successful. He had a lot of friends, always popular. He joined a fraternity, had a beautiful girlfriend. I never knew to check in on his mental health, even when he went through things that were hard, because he was always laughing and joking and the joy of my life. I now realize that there were some things that I missed because he masked them as stress, or oh, I'm just really busy. Even though we talked about everything, I feel like had I asked the right questions, my son would still be here. So I had to journal to try to make sense out of things, and my journaling turned into my book. Sharing my experience was very important to me, to tell everyone how wonderful he was, because I fell into the stigma of thinking that someone that was so depressed that would be led to suicide would have to be awkward. Wouldn't be funny. Definitely not the most hilarious person I know. Not successful. Like I fell into that stigma. So when this happened, I was very embarrassed. I felt like the worst mom ever because I missed this. I realize now, after writing my book and sharing my story, that a lot of people go through it, but just don't talk about it. And specifically in my community, the Black community, we really don't talk about it. We were brought up to say what happens in this house stays in this house. We were brought up to say, go to church and pray about it. We don't need therapy. I needed to break down those stigmas because there are a lot of us that are struggling silently, and some of us are losing that struggle.
Thank you. Jessie, can you please share your story?
Yes, mine also is about my son, and his life was a challenge from the get-go. He had learning disabilities. I shouldn't say from the get-go. As a toddler, he appeared very much like any other toddler. He was a little bit more of a management problem maybe than his older sister, but actually he's a boy, that's what they tell you. They're more challenging. By the time he started preschool, the teacher would tell me, he doesn't take his turn when prompted. He's not paying attention, he doesn't seem available for learning. And I had noticed that. He was the kind of child that you had to touch him if you wanted his attention, and even that didn't always work. He was never diagnosed with a specific label, but after a couple of years of school and a lot of learning specialists, he was identified as having a language impairment and a hand tremor. And those two things really hold you back in school because you need fine motor skills to do the writing that school requires. And the language impairment was a serious handicap because with the kind of language impairment he had, his word retrieval was slow. So if he was in a conversation, even with a group of family members or neighbors or in a classroom, he had deeper thoughts than people realized, but by the time he found the word and could get it all the way through the pathways to saying it, the conversation had inevitably moved on. So what he learned at an early age is, he didn't quite measure up, he didn't enter into conversations, he was quiet. And so others liked him, he was kind, he was always sweet to his teachers and his classmates. But as he moved into his teenage years, he started to realize that he wasn't learning the things that other kids were learning. He didn't know how to do long division, for example, when other kids were doing it, and you start to measure yourself against others. And so his innate happiness sort of took a hit. But he was still very close to me and very communicative with me, and I was still very optimistic. We couldn't find a school, and one of the best neurologists in the country, who happened to be here at Hopkins and at the Kennedy Institute, told me she'd never seen anybody like him, and that there was no real perfect school, that we just would have to make do with a school that would take him. By the time he graduated from high school, he'd been to 10 schools. I've lived in the same town my whole life. His sister went to the same school for 15 years, so change and I don't just automatically find each other. So it was a struggle. It was in his 20s that he started to take drugs, and at first it was unknown to me, but it makes so much sense to me in hindsight how he wasn't socializing, it wasn't a party situation. He was masking his pain, and when you first have that drug that does make you feel good, the saddest thing is you say to yourself, oh my goodness, I can be like everybody else. I can enter into this conversation. I feel good, I feel confident. This is just the best thing that's ever happened to me. Well, the tragedy is that's the beginning of the road to hell. And so throughout his years of addiction, schooling was a struggle. The years of addiction were downright harrowing. And he was marginalized, his disabilities didn't help him. He was misunderstood, he was just completely misunderstood. He was incarcerated at one point, he was sexually abused, he was stolen from. You'd send your child a green dot money card so they could use the commissary, and I wanted him to use the commissary because when we would talk, he would tell me he was hungry, and he was hungry all the time. And let me just stop and tell you, when your child's hungry, you can't eat. And so the minute he'd take that card out of the envelope in the jail system, another inmate would rip it out of his hands, and he said to me, Mom, don't send that anymore. So he got much better though in terms of the drug use. He outgrew it to some extent. He'd have relapses now and then, and he finally got a job that he loved. It was perfect for him, and he had his first apartment, and he was very proud of it, and he relapsed. But he couldn't find any help. There was no mental health provider that could help him. The emergency room couldn't help him. He finally got into a temporary facility that was looking into a next placement, and he smoked a cigarette in the bathroom, and that was against the rules, so they put him out. And so he was out on the street, and he said to me though, when he got home, he said, I'm gonna look on the bright side, Mom, I can keep my job, and if you can find me Suboxone, which is brand name for buprenorphine, which is one of the most successful medications for people with opioid use disorder. And he had had it once before, maybe 10 years before, and he knew how much it helped him. And I joined him in trying to find it, and while I was working on that, he died, and he died alone. And so I knew right there from the get-go that getting the medication that helps you is hard. Finding the street drugs that can kill you is easy. And so that started my quest of telling my story, and I also wrote a book right here. You can't see how cute he is like you can, because his picture is little on the back. But that's our story. What I learned is another whole part of this conversation.
Tonia, can you please share with the group how you found support, sources of support that you sought or that you found for yourself?
So I immediately sought therapy. That was my first step. But it was very important for me to join a bereavement group specific to suicide, because I was so embarrassed and felt so alone and did not know anyone else dealing with this issue. I didn't want to be in a mixed bereavement group. I wanted to be in a group where everyone was dealing with the exact same type of loss. And I was able to find the group that I joined through Postvention Resources of Maryland. So it's just the state of Maryland, but I'm sure that Virginia, DC, probably has the exact same type of link. It's just Postvention Resources of Maryland.
Thank you. And Jesse, I have the same question for you. In terms of sources of support that you sought or that you found were helpful.
The first thing I started to do was write the book. And I learned in hindsight that they tell you never write a book while you're grieving. I didn't know that. I was driven to do it because also with regard to my son, he wrote poetry. And even as a 12-year-old, he would write under the covers at night. But his handwriting was impossible to read because of his language, because of his hand trim. But when he died, he had given me his password to everything. I mean, to his contact with his girlfriends, to Facebook, to everything. So I got his laptop and I looked at his poetry, and because he had a spell check and because he could type at that point in time, I was just driven to share. I thought no one will ever come to know him and how many thoughts he had. So I did that, and I found that therapeutic. But then I encountered doing research for the book and even making the connections that you make when you write about your own life, seeing something that happened to him when he was 16 and how that connected to choices that he made when he was 23 that you might not have put together before, and mistakes that I made. I just started pulling so many things together, and through that, and then doing some research about addiction, I connected with people that really inspired me, and that was really my solace beyond writing the book. Groups here in Baltimore, some of them national, and I have really joined forces with these people who I'm impressed, even know who I am, much less, reach out to me and have helped me. So I've become an advocate for drug policy reform, and I believe we have a long way to go in that regard. And in terms of incarcerating somebody for possession of drugs, I just don't understand it, and it's disproportionately black and brown people as well as people with disabilities, and it's really insidious when you look at black and white people use drugs to the same extent, but the number of people incarcerated that are black versus white is shameful. And so that's just one element of what we're doing wrong, and of course the United States has the highest overdose rate in the world and the highest incarceration rate. So those two facts right there tell you all that we have to do to move forward. So I learned a lot about stigma, I learned a lot about grief, and I have told other people that I speak with when they're grieving on top of feeling stigmatized by whatever it was that they're grieving over. My bottom line is shame is a waste of time. I don't know how to put it more simply. Just move beyond it. You did, first of all, nobody's a perfect parent. And secondly, we all make mistakes, and if we can turn our mistakes into something that helps somebody else, then it was all worthwhile. And that's all we can do in any community, that elders can help the younger people in a lot of ways. And I think the more connections we can make, the better. So I just have gotten a lot out of trying to spare others his fate. And so I guess that's been my solace, and the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people that I've met along the way.
Thank you, Jessie. I just wanted to say, same for me. As embarrassed as I was, the more understanding that I had, I no longer feel like I was a bad mom. I was a great mom. And it's not anything to be embarrassed about that I lost my son this way. The thing to be embarrassed about is that we don't talk about it. If I don't share my story, another mother will never hear the signs that I miss.
Thank you.